Broadcasting from New York City to the world, it's the G-Man Interviews.
Welcome. Chris Pepus is an American freelance writer whose work has appeared in such publications as Razorcake, The Progressive, In These Times, SCLC Magazine, The Chicago Reader, and American Theater. A son of manual laborers, his writings have focused on what he describes as the most studiously ignored concept in the U.S.A, social class. He's actively involved with researching legal and educational reform, as well as the ways culture reflects the values of the elite. As a white person of the working class, I'm not shy about addressing the media's treatment of people it considers white trash. I believe the most important question today is how to unite working class people of different racial and religious backgrounds, genders, sexualities, and nationalities, Pepus notes. The outspoken writer and activist, who's penned controversial articles on comedian Bill Maher and New York Times columnist David Brooks, joins me to discuss his recent resignation from Washington University in St. Louis, his battle to have his Facebook page reinstated, and the inherent danger facing many of the nation's low-income teens and adolescents planning to attend top colleges or universities. Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
I'd like to begin the discussion by asking you to provide an overview of your educational background.
I got a bachelor's degree in government and history at the University of Virginia, where I was a scholarship student, and then I got a master's degree at Virginia as well in history. And then after that, after a couple of years of work, I wound up in the PhD program at Washington University in St. Louis. But the job prospects in academic work are not very, at least in terms of teaching history, we're not very good at that point. So I decided to see if there was something else I could do. And I wound up at the Film Archive at the University, where I ultimately a full-time staff member.
Speaking of the university, on its website, there are two statements. The first statement is from Chancellor Mark Wrighton. Enhancing diversity and inclusiveness for facility staff and students at Washington University in St. Louis is a top priority. And the diversity section reads as follows. Our goals: to attract people of great ability from all backgrounds, to encourage facility and students to be bold, independent, and creative thinkers, and to provide infrastructure to support teaching, research, scholarship, and service for the present and for future generations. Washington University intends to judge itself by the most demanding standards. The Center for Diversity and Inclusion at Washington University is a cornerstone in the university's effort to create a welcoming and collaborative community. The center supports and advocates for students from traditionally underrepresented and marginalized populations and promotes dialogue and social change through partnership across the Danforth campus. Now, based on what you wrote in your blog, everything that they're saying is quite the contrary. So, when did you begin to suspect that something wasn't quite right with the admissions policy and or program, and could you provide an example or two?
Well, I think it started when maybe 6-7 years ago, it started to become the practice for journalists who were writing about diversity on college campuses to start using as a benchmark the Pell Grant program, which is a federal scholarship, as you know, that goes to low and middle income students. And I started noticing as I learned more about the percentages of Pell Grant at different universities around the country, Washington University really did wind up ranking very low on those time and time again. And in particular, there were a couple of instances where there were rankings done. One was by the Chronicle of Higher Education in 2011. And the New York Times then after that started doing rankings of the most prestigious universities in terms, or listings anyway, of the most prestigious universities in terms of the percentage of Pell Grant recipients on campus. And WashU consistently was finishing at the bottom in terms of those rankings. And in fact, at the latest ones we've been talking about, and this is one of the things I mentioned in the letter, Washington University is at 6% now. And if you look at the U.S. News and World Report rankings on social diversity of the most exclusive or the most prestigious universities on the U.S. News and World Report list, what you'll find is they're way behind even the schools that are just ahead of them on the ranking. The second from the bottom is Caltech at 11, WashU's at 6, and then above that you have Princeton and Notre Dame at 12%. So they've been aware of this problem, and they've been made aware of it by the New York Times, by the Chronicle of Higher Education, And they've been saying for some time they're going to do something about it. And then in January, they proposed to do something about it. And I found their proposal to be grossly inadequate, considering how long they gave themselves to get to a not very high, in my opinion, not very high bar.
Prior to your decision to write and post your blog, did you attempt to meet with the university chancellor to discuss your concerns?
No, I didn't. I had been reading a lot of the statements that the administrators had been making, and frankly, I was getting increasingly offended by them. The one I wrote about in the resignation letter, Holden Thorpe was brought in from the University of North Carolina to be the provost of Washington University. And he'd been asked a couple times by student groups that were pushing for more diversity in terms of social diversity. And he repeatedly gave the same answer, which was, well, you know, it's not really anybody's fault that we are this lacking in diversity now. And the thing that I thought was most offensive was he cast it in terms of, we had other priorities. We wanted to make WashU a better university. So we couldn't really worry about social diversity until now. And he actually said at one point, we're not going to apologize for that. That's either a paraphrase or a direct quote. But he refused to apologize for how badly they'd done on this point. And I was personally, as you know, I'm the first in my family to go to college. My parents were manual laborers. Only my mom finished high school. My father didn't finish high school. And so to hear these statements again and again, where administrators would say, well, it's not really anybody's fault we wound up in this situation, and we had to focus on improving the university, I found that offensive. And I think it's just making this false dichotomy. Well, we wanted to hire more women on the faculty, or we wanted to admit more women into the university, but, you know, we really had to worry about improving quality instead. We can either be excellent or we can have poor people here. I think that's offensive. And increasingly, I was getting offended by this as time went on, and they seem to be very dug in on that approach.
And has Chancellor Wrighton responded to any of the points you presented in the letter?
When I sent the letter out, I sent it out as an open letter through an email to the chancellor and the library system and members of the administration. I did get a reply that morning, which I'm paraphrasing. I didn't get to print it out. As you may recall, I was asked to depart the university very quickly after I sent that letter. But the response I got was simply along the lines of, I acknowledge receipt of your letter of resignation, or something to that effect. That was all I got.
That was the extent of it?
Yes.
Have associates, colleagues, or friends at the university responded to the letter?
I've heard from a few people at the university who actually I didn't have much contact with before, and who've asked not to be named, who've been very supportive, and have said that I'm saying things that need to be said.
And what impact, if any, has your letter and or resignation had on the students?
I don't know how many students know at this point. I actually reached out to Student Life, which is the student newspaper at WashU, and I was hoping that maybe they would want to perhaps publish the open letter or something to that effect, or talk to me. I haven't heard back from them, and I was looking on their webpage. I didn't see any references to it the last time I checked. So I don't know. The impression I get from people who either know somebody at WashU or who are at WashU who've heard about this letter, it's kind of being passed around via email, or some people have shared the letter on Facebook, and some have forwarded it on Twitter and things like that, retweeted it. So I'm getting the impression it's kind of moving out there in the underground gradually, and I don't know to what extent it's being understood about on campus, except from a few people who've been passing it around from one to another. So I don't know. And
as far as them printing your letter in the college newspaper, is that likely to happen, or is the university likely to prevent that from happening?
I don't think it's going to happen. I think it's going to have to go through other outlets rather than through WashU. And I think in general, that fits with the approach that I'm taking with this, because I don't think the reform really can come from within WashU. I think it's going to have to come from outside.
Why did Facebook block your page, and how did you get them to reactivate it?
We're still trying to figure that out. I have a friend who I used to work with in the libraries, and she wanted to post it on her Facebook page, and she did. And it was up there for a number of hours, and then it got taken down. And after that, she and some other friends tried to put it up, and they kept getting a message saying that the link was deemed unsafe. The word was unsafe. So I wrote to Facebook. My friends complained to Facebook. One of the friends who complained was journalist Greg Palast. You know, I always tell people you don't really know what's going on in the U.S. if you don't read what Greg Palast is writing. But he raised some noise about this, and I think that was very helpful in getting them to stop it. So the letter went out on Wednesday. I think it was taken down from my friend's Facebook page on Wednesday, and then it wasn't until Friday that it was up again. But in the meantime, there were myself and I and other people were working on trying to get them to just allow it.
People listening may ask, if he was so upset with the university's admission policies, why did he wait so long to go public or resign? How would you respond?
Well, I think, this is one of the things I talked about in the letter, and that is that I think at some point you have to take responsibility. And I kept putting it off and putting off raising this issue directly with WashU by saying, well, I'm doing a lot of freelance writing. I'm dealing with these issues in other contexts. At some point, that's going to break for me. At some point, I'll be able to have a bigger platform. And when I get to that point, then I'll raise these issues. I would tell myself that. And also, frankly, there were other things as well that, like I mentioned in the letter, that, well, I need my health insurance, I would say. The other jobs that I'm having a shot at getting tend not to be jobs that have good health insurance at all. And so it was kind of a combination of a practical approach that, well, I'm not finding other positions that have the health insurance I need. And I have had some instances where I had to go to the emergency room for various health problems and would have been wiped out, really, if it hadn't been for the health insurance I had at the time. So there is that practical consideration, which I don't think excuses me for staying there that long in itself. But there's also kind of hoping that you're going to be able to make a breakthrough with other writing, and then you can address all this. So it's a classic case, I think, and I think a lot of people can identify with this who stayed in a job that they had objections to. You tell yourself a lot of stories about how you're going to straighten it all out later. And eventually I had to look in the mirror and say, well, you've been telling yourself this for a long time. And maybe now's the time. Maybe you have to take a big step to try to get this issue out there. And maybe this is what you have to do. And that's really how it came about for me.
In the specific section where you worked, the Film and Media Archive, there's a lot of material regarding civil rights and social issues that were addressed by some of the country's greatest pioneers from the Black community. That played a central role in your decision as well, did it not?
Yes, it did. I mean, I kept feeling that I was kind of living a lie every day I was there. And the materials that I was working with in my job as an archive assistant, they raised these issues to me. They reminded me of the things that I had not addressed and that I was postponing addressing. And one of the things that was central in that is that if you look at Eyes on the Prize, there is a very important segment on the Poor People's Campaign, which was the last thing Dr. King was working on, along with the sanitation workers' strike in Memphis. And seeing that and seeing the courage of people who were raising this issue before I was even born, and seeing the consequences that people suffered in the civil rights movement and the labor movement, these were things that came out in these materials in the film, like the film Eyes on the Prize, the material for which are housed at the archive, like in the film The Great Depression. And eventually you start to feel accused, I think, if you can be in contact with the kind of achievements and the work and the courage of these people, and you're dealing with it every day, you're telling everybody about it. I would give presentations on this. And eventually you finish the day and you feel that you've been accused to some extent, and you're accusing yourself of not being properly influenced by these. You feel that these items should have made a change in your life, or they should have prompted you to be better. And I felt that I wasn't living up to that at all.
A recent U.S.A. Today article noted the following. Democratic State Senator Hank Sanders of Selma, one of the thousands of African Americans elected to office after the Voting Rights Act was signed, is among those worried the Supreme Court's 2013 decision will turn back the clock on voting rights. I found the comment extremely interesting because when I did reports on the New York City school system, several principals and teachers from very different ethnic backgrounds expressed concern that a full-scale effort was underway to turn back the clock on equal access to education. Do you agree?
Yeah, I think we're seeing a full-fledged attack. There's an attack on affirmative action, there's an attack on the Voting Rights Act, and I'm very concerned about this. I think we're definitely moving the clock backward. One of the things that motivates you and all the issues I've raised, I want to see a coalition. Americans alongside Hispanics, alongside some immigrants, and I'm always shocked and appalled at the divisions among working class people. And as a working class white person, I feel this very acutely because there are so many working class white people that if we look at the polls, are voting for far right candidates who are promoting this attack. And I want to try to build that coalition, or at least advocate and talk about getting to that coalition and pointing the way to that coalition. So I think if we want to save affirmative action, one of the things we need to do is expand its scope to include working class people in general, including working class white people.
And as far as the attacks are concerned, why do you believe they're happening at this particular time?
I think the Republicans, they're looking at the demographics and they're seeing that their voting bloc or their voting base is getting older, and the appeals that they were able to use to keep that base happy are not going as well with younger whites. I think also they're worried about immigration. And so I think they're trying to turn back the clock on voting rights and to challenge voting rights with these new laws that we're seeing in places like Texas. And of course, Greg Palast has written a lot about this. So I think they're really trying to knock off enough voters from the rolls to keep things going for the Republican Party, at least in the short term.
You stated the following at the close of your resignation letter. No top American college is as far away from social diversity as Washington U, and you are clearly happy for it to stay that way. So here's my 2-week notice. I can no longer stand by and be associated with class bigotry that is deeply entrenched in this institution. Many at some of the most prestigious colleges and universities in America may share your sentiment, but they're reluctant to speak out because it would cost them their livelihood, position, and tenure. If they aren't willing to step up and speak out against these conditions, how can anyone, including you, expect things to change?
Yeah, I think that's really the issue. And I think that's why I've been trying to reach out in particular. I mean, one of the reasons I wanted to do it right at this time is that there are a couple of issues. One, we're now at the point where people are getting their acceptance or rejection letters from college. And so it's on people's minds. Which school did I get into? Which school did I not? And also, we're coming up on tax day. And Washington University is tax exempt. And I think the problem with an institution that has such a low percentage of Pell Grant recipients and is not taxed, it's very poignant and frustrating to me because I've seen a lot of cuts in education budgets around the country, and yet we have these elite private institutions with multi-billion-dollar endowments that do not pay tax. And it's especially frustrating to me because Washington University still practices legacy preferences, which I think are a backward, medieval way of approaching admissions. It's essentially aristocracy by another name. This is a preference for people who have parents who went to the university, and particularly ones who've donated a lot of money. And from my point of view, there's all this talk about diversity and achievement. But the fact is, if you come from a very wealthy family and you've had all the advantages and you went to an expensive school, if you can't get into Washington University on your merits, you really don't belong there. And so they're actually, by bringing in these legacies and having preferences and giving breaks to people like that, they're actually bringing in the least qualified people in their pool, or just about the least qualified people. And nobody ever says, oh, well, that's a problem for our standards of excellence. Nobody ever seemed to see it that way, at least not within these administrations. And I just don't think that this aristocratic, medieval, bigoted policy of favoring the rich and well-connected should go hand in hand with receiving tax exemptions. If you're going to do that, then don't put your hand out to the taxpayer and ask the taxpayer to cover your tax exemptions.
Another point you mentioned in your letter of resignation is the fact that Washington University in St. Louis has earned a significant amount of money in endowments. How much to date has the university obtained?
It was $5.3 billion according to the latest federal statistics.
5.3?
Yes. And I compared them to the University of California at Berkeley, which has an endowment ratio. I'd have to look it up, but I think it's 1.2 billion, or at least at the last count. And I said, well, UC Berkeley has a much smaller endowment than WashU, and yet, if you look at the percentage of Pell Grant recipients, UC Berkeley is at 36 and WashU is at 6. How can WashU have this much more money than this other very highly rated university, yet have only 1/6 as many Pell Grant recipients? And under their new approach, which they've announced that they're trying to improve on Pell Grant recipients, they're saying that if we give them 5 years, they'll get to 13% in the freshman class of 2020. I just think that's too tiny a step and far too slow. The resources are there. UC Berkeley proves that you don't have to give up excellence by allowing working class people into your student body. Seems to me that they should take the step now, and they shouldn't be saying, give us 5 years and we'll get to maybe a third or so of where UC Berkeley is. And we might even get out of last place among the top colleges if we're really lucky, and if the others who are ahead of us stay where they are. For a school this rich, that seems to be just a waste of time.
If there's anything else you'd like to say in closing, please take this opportunity to do so.
Well, I would say that, if people enjoyed this conversation, I think this is an example of what we need to have in the media today, where you have independent producers and where you have people who, just everyday people like myself who are trying to get the word out. I think we need to start paying some more attention to people who are outside of the giant corporate conglomerates who give us our media most of the time. I've reached out to a lot of them, and there's been a lot of reluctance for them to talk to me. And I think this discussion is taking place in part because you're a guy who doesn't have a corporate boss over his shoulder stopping him from doing what he wants to do. And I hope this is something that people will consider. Supporting independent media and supporting independent voices. Look for yourself and see if people are telling the truth. I mentioned in my article, I provided evidence for it. So if anybody disagrees with it, if they think I'm making stuff up, please look at the links and tell me where I'm wrong, and I'll be happy to engage with you on that.
Your resignation letter will be posted in the description area, so people will be able to pull it up, as well as several other articles that you've written.
Well, thank you very much.
Again, I thank you for joining me, Mr. Pepus. I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me.
On April 1st, the following email was sent to the office of Chancellor Mark Wrighton and administrators at the university's Center for Diversity and Inclusion. Chancellor Wrighton, on April 2nd, I will be conducting an interview with Mr. Chris Pepus, who worked in the university's Film and Media Archive Department, to discuss his controversial blog post and recent resignation from your institution. If your department would like to submit a comment on the allegations presented in his letter of resignation, please feel free to do so via this email address. Your statement will be included in the episode. To date, there has been no response from Chancellor Wrighton or representatives at the Center for Diversity and Inclusion. I'm the G-Man, and I thank you for joining me. Until next time, stay cool, stay safe, and stay informed.